Hi, everyone. All right, here we are. My apologies for the confusion. I made a terrible error in judgment and tried to go up to Vermont for the week, and I was promised there was going to be good internet. It turned out there was very bad internet, and I was not able to make my recordings work. So I'm back now, and my apologies truly for any scheduling issues. Um, anyway, so today we are moving on from Freud, and we're beginning our reading of Madness and Civilization by Michel Foucault. So Foucault is an interesting character in philosophy, and so his dates are 1926 to 1984. So he spans, the chunk of the middle of the 20th century. He's one of the most one of the philosophers most associated with 1960s philosophy. He's a French philosopher, and so in particular associated with French sort of cultural resistance in the 60s. So Foucault is an interesting figure. Foucault, as you probably have seen for yourself in reading Madness and Civilization, it doesn't really read like philosophy. It doesn't read like the other philosophers that we've read so far. It reads more like history, more maybe like anthropology or sociology. And Foucault is very much aware of this, and this is intentional. He is a philosopher. He was, head of the chair of the philosophy department at École Normale Supérieure, which is one of the most prestigious philosophy departments in France, in Paris. So he is trained as a philosopher, but he's writing what appears to be history, what appears to be anthropology. And so in order to understand him, it's necessary to think about the history that he's telling from a philosophical perspective, and to sort of orient what he's saying within the history of philosophy and within, in this case, the history of civilization itself. So Foucault is engaged in anthropology, sociology, and history. What he's trying to show by engaging in these disciplines is a kind of material evidence for the way that modernity really works. By that I mean, he's looking for material evidence of sort of ideological projects. How does ideology really function? Is one way we could think of Foucault's project, Foucault's question. His method he calls archaeological. He wants to sort of excavate the concealed origins of various cultural events. He wants to excavate the concealed material origins of certain ideological events or inventions. So this archaeology that he does is about uncovering heterodoxical, counterintuitive histories. Foucault is called, what I mean by that, these heterodoxical, and counterintuitive histories, is Foucault is looking for historical narratives that sort of contradict or reveal something hidden about standard traditional stories that we tell ourselves. He wants to challenge sort of standard historical narratives that accompany various ideologies. Any ideology, any political ideology, for example, any economic ideology, has some historical narrative that goes along with it. Right? History up till now has been this way, and therefore we need a democratic revolution. History up till now has been this way, and therefore we need a capitalist economy, a free market economy, something like that, right? A historical narrative is indispensable to an ideological project. And so Foucault is looking to excavate, right, through this sort of intellectual archaeology, the material evidence of historical narratives that contradict those historical narratives that are part of political, economic, cultural ideologies. And so this is sort of the essence of his involvement in 60s counterculture, right? He's a countercultural philosopher, sort of in the most straightforward sense. He's looking for these counter historical narratives that challenge the sort of status quo narrative, the conventional narrative, the ideologically acceptable narrative, acceptable to power, to the reigning ideology, the reigning political, economic, social regime of a state. So Foucault is called many things. He's labeled by some to be a postmodernist, and by others to be a structuralist, by others to be a post-structuralist. The only sort of term that I know of that Foucault has not objected to and rejected is that he is a thinker of discontinuous history, that he seeks, again, to find evidence that our historical narratives are incomplete. There are always many historical narratives that we can tell about civilization, about history, and that no one narrative is correct. There is no such thing as a kind of master narrative of history. History is about interpretation, and there are always other interpretations of history. So I think this is, one of the things that's one of the reasons it's interesting to read Foucault, especially after having just read Civilization and Its Discontents by Freud, right, where Freud is giving us very much kind of master narrative of history. Right? History is the development of a cultural superego, and history is the way that cultural superego exerts control over the population. And all of this can be explained through psychoanalysis, through an understanding of the psyche, and in particular, the way the superego controls the aggressive impulse, right, the death drive of human beings. That's the master narrative that Freud gives us. And as I mentioned, right, Freud is himself piggybacking on a master narrative that had been developed since, I think we can trace it back to at least Thomas Hobbes, if not to Plato. This sort of basic narrative about how civilization develops historically, in opposition to nature, right? The development of the human spirit from out of nature. And all of this is really what Foucault wants to challenge, right? I think it's not important whether or not we contextualize this as postmodern or structuralist or post-structuralist, but to understand that Foucault is interested in complicating our understanding of history and these master historical narratives that people like Freud deploy in order to justify their interpretation of civilization, right? In order to, in essence, offer a kind of moral read on our contemporary behavior, right? What is Freud's point? What is Freud doing in Civilization's Discontents? How does this master narrative serve him? It allows him to make certain moral judgments about what we should and shouldn't do, right? We need to have this sort of moderate conception of justice, one that's not overly prohibitive, but one that is nevertheless going to rein in our most aggressive or erotic desires. And so Freud uses a master narrative to prescribe some kind of moral program to justify his moral beliefs. And that point, right, to say this master narrative serves a kind of moral agenda, that is Foucault's point. That is, I think, we could say the overarching project of Foucault. And we certainly see that at work in his first book, Foucault's first book, Madness and Civilization. Madness and Civilization is a little bit, I think, sloppier, a little bit more grandiose than some of his later projects, Discipline and Punish, The History of Sexuality, and other later works. But we really see in Madness and Civilization all of Foucault's major themes and ideas, as well as this method of historical intellectual archaeology at work. And I chose Madness and Civilization to read because of the major theme of this book, which is obviously madness. And madness itself is very central to the historical period that we are more or less focusing on this class, and the central ideas. So let me try and zoom out for just a minute, hopefully, here. And so we began with Descartes. Right? And what is Descartes' project? Descartes' project is to delineate what we might call the realm of pure reason, to borrow a phrase from a later philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Descartes wants to identify what I can know truly using just my rationality, right? With nothing but reason, as just a thinking thing. What can I know? And Descartes says, viewing the world through this kind of pure rationality, I know that I myself am a thinking thing with a power of judgment. That's my essence. Right? I am a thinking thing. I am a rationality. And what I can know about the world, using pure rationality, using only rationality, is the world as a mathematical scientific object. The only way I can have certain knowledge about the world is through math or science. So as we to recall what we were talking about in that first lecture on Descartes, right, this rationalism of Descartes leads to a major shift in the way philosophy views the world and views human beings. Human beings are pure rationalities, and the world is a scientific mathematical object that a rationality is able to have knowledge of through rational judgment. Descartes, as we know, is referred to as the father of modern philosophy. Right? Modernity, modern philosophy begins with Descartes and this new formulation of rationalism. So, because rationalism is the foundation of modernity, then we can see the way this Cartesian rationalism, this scientific worldview, is again duplicated in existentialism and in Freud. With Foucault, we saw this a little bit with Arendt and a little bit with Sartre. My French is not terrible, actually, but I always have anxiety about pronouncing Sartre. With Foucault, for the first time, we see, in a different way, this rationalism challenged. What Foucault is interested in an analysis of madness, is to show the way that reason can only be defined by excluding madness. The human being can only be defined as a pure rationality by excluding madness. Now, Foucault is going to talk about Descartes explicitly later on. So we'll save this discussion and go into it in more detail in subsequent lecture. But just for the moment, let's just orient this discussion about madness and recognize that, the subtitle of this book is A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. What Foucault is interested in is thinking about the way that madness defines reason and reason defines madness. The way these two terms work together with each other. And in thinking about a history of insanity in the age of reason, he's thinking about also the way that the idea of reason is invented, and simultaneously the idea of unreason, of madness, is invented in a certain sense. I think one of the big ideas here, one of the philosophical ideas that Foucault is sort of intimating, is implying through this history that he's telling, is the thought that our concept of madness, like our concept of reason, is determined by what he calls a sensibility toward madness. And in certain other places, page 46, I believe, let me see if I can pull this up, he talks about this as the perception of madness. And so our sensibility toward madness, our perception of madness, perception and sensibility to reason are the ways that our concepts of these things are determined, right? So our perception, our sensibility is prior to our intellectual delimitation of the concept. He says, it is this, on page 45, It is this mode of perception we must investigate in order to discover the form of sensibility to madness in an epoch we are accustomed to define by the privileges of reason. Right? The act which, by tracing the locus of confinement, conferred upon it its power of segregation, segregation between reason and unreason, between the sane and the mad, and provided a new homeland for madness, though it may be coherent and concerted, is not simple. Okay, right, so here on page 45, I think Foucault is sort of really laying out what he's interested in. Right? This mode of perception of madness that we must investigate in order to understand the sensibility toward madness, what people, how people made sense of it. It's different than a sort of rational, logical definition. A general cultural sense of reason and madness is prior to and informs any sort of logical definition. So this act, which traces the segregation between madness and reason, right, provides a new homeland for madness, locates madness, defines madness in a new way. It understands madness differently than previous ages, right? The age of reason, in the age after Descartes, madness is located in a new homeland. It's defined differently. We have a different sensibility toward it. He goes on. So he says, right, the way that this happens, though it may be coherent and concerted, is not simple. So how madness is segregated from reason, and how madness is given this new homeland is a story that makes sense, but it's not simple. And so this is Foucault, 45 pages into his discussion, sort of revealing what he's up to a little bit, right? This is the complicated story of how madness becomes redefined. So this movement to redefine madness, he says, organizes into a complex unity a new sensibility to poverty and to the duties of assistance, new forms of reaction to the economic problems of unemployment and idleness, a new ethic of work, and also the dream of a city where moral obligation was joined to civil law within the authoritarian forms of constraint. So I think this is really important. What is this really all about? What in the first place shifts our sensibility toward madness, our perception of what madness is, and what reason is, right? If a sensibility precedes a conceptualization, then what is it that accounts for the shifting of sensibility? What is it that precedes the formulation of a sensibility, or the formation of a sensibility? And here, now on page 46, Foucault is giving a hint, right? And again, this is sort of, I think, one of the reasons why Foucault is difficult to read, is that the point of all this is always sort of concealed or hidden. Right? It's only revealed through these hints at certain moments. Right? What is this history really showing us? He says, right, this segregation of madness from reason, the confinement of madness from reason, organizes into a complex unity a new sensibility to poverty. What do we get from this shift in sensibility? A change in the way we think about the poor. What is accomplished through this shift in sensibility is a shift in other sensibilities. By changing the way we feel about madness, or in the particular way that madness comes to be defined in beginning in the classical era, but then developing into the modern era. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But for our purposes now, right, the way that madness and reason are defined within modernity, within under the auspices of Cartesian philosophy. What's accomplished by this definition, this new homeland of madness, is a shift in our conception also of poverty, and he says the duties of assistance. What we owe people, how much assistance we owe people. New forms of reaction to the economic problems of unemployment and idleness. And so new ways of dealing with unemployment and idleness. So what Foucault is saying is that what accounts or what is happening in this shift is not caused by philosophical reflection, not caused either by simply our sort of sense of the world, but what causes a shift in our sense of the world, and hence a shift in our sensibilities toward various phenomena in the world, like madness and reason. And consequently, after that, a shift in our conceptualization of madness and reason. What lies at the bottom of all of this is a need to respond to economic problems, unemployment, idleness, poverty, right? We need a new way of dealing with these social problems. And in order to deal with these social problems, we need to rethink madness, rethink poverty, rethink assistance, right? It's very interesting, right? That in order to respond to economic problems like unemployment, Foucault is saying what happens is we, in this period, transform the way we think about madness. And by changing what we think about madness, we're able to change the way we think about the poor. And in changing the way we think about the poor, we're able to bring it back, respond to those economic problems. We get from this also a new work ethic and the dream of a city where moral obligation is joined to civil law. All right. Now, let's stay on this for a moment. On page 46, Foucault is suggesting this is a kind of dispersed, as it were, decentralized social phenomenon, this shift in our conception of madness. And well, we shouldn't say decentralized. We should say instead that it is a kind of subterranean movement, this shift in sensibility. It is not a kind of explicit project. No one sets out to change the meaning of madness. It is, I think it's useful to think about it in relation to Freud, actually. In many, many ways that Foucault is different from Freud. And, I think we can think of Madness and Civilization as really a direct sort of rejoinder to civilization and its discontents, this idea, not just challenging the master narrative, but also, right, challenging the very sort of foundation of a Freudian conception of madness, a Freudian conception of reason. Foucault wants to sort of undercut that psychoanalytic understanding of reason and of madness, of neuroses, of mental illness, right? That will become a major theme later on in this book. But we can say, in that final point that I made about civilization and its discontents, right, that what Freud is really interested in here is thinking about this idea of a kind of subterranean force of social control, which is not explicitly part of the agenda of power, of those in power, but which is what ultimately props up power, makes power possible in a certain sense, right? These subterranean forms of social control, of which we are unconscious, but which oppress us sort of from within ourselves. This is, I think, the most important point of connection. And for Freud, we exert a control over ourselves that is to the benefit of society. We do this unconsciously, unknowingly. Society has colonized us, right? As I said in the video, that's my term, not Freud's term, but I think it's appropriate. And I think that's roughly what Foucault is saying here also, right? That it's not our unconscious. It's not that there's this structure to the psyche and the superego is this unconscious force that is the figure of our father, etc., right? None of that is precisely at all what Foucault is saying. But the more general concept of social control is important, right? So for Freud, it's the superego or cultural ideals. The band of brothers that erects this ideal that serves as a cultural sort of form of constraint. Foucault is saying something similar, right? That there is this sensibility, this sort of cultural idea, not an ideal per se, but just cultural sensibility. And that cultural sensibility also sort of colonizes us in a way, right? In the sense that we accept the cultural mores of our homeland, right? And in that sense, we're kind of colonized by these cultural ideals, these cultural ideas, and that because those live within us, they shape the way we perceive the world, our sensibility to the world. And when those change, we will accommodate new ways of being controlled for the purpose of living in society, and new ways of controlling ourselves. So Foucault, I think, is saying, we could say this is a simplification, but Freud had the idea of social control right, But he thought there was only sort of one mechanism of social control, which is the mechanisms of the psyche and the unconscious. Foucault is saying, no, the mechanisms of social control are also driven by economic concerns, by material concerns. And that the reason that we are controlled, the reason why we, the purpose of social control is not to, control our aggressiveness or our erotic energy. The purpose of social control is to contain the poor, to contain and confine the poor, to neutralize the threat of the poor. For Foucault, this social control, the form of social control, changes in the modern age, in modernity. Above all, social control is in this new form exerted through institutions. And so this is why he spends so long thinking about Hôpital Général, the confinement in Paris, in France. This is why he's analyzing all of these institutions for housing the mad, for housing the poor as well. Right? So institutions are the tool of social control preferred by the modern period, by modernity. Now, this social control exerted through institutions is, Foucault says, the essential meaning of the police. Still on page 46, he says, confinement, that massive phenomenon, the signs of which are found all across 18th century Europe, is a police matter. Police in the precise sense that the classical epoch gave to it, that is, the totality of measures which make work possible and necessary for all those who could not live without it. The police, right, in the classical era, and by the classical era, Foucault is referring to the 16th century, the 1500s, right? And it's in the classical era, sort of 15, second half of the 15th century, second half of the 1500s, first half of the 1600s. And then we get this shift, right? We recall, Descartes is writing right there, smack in the middle of the 1600s. So this classical concept of police is, right, the totality of measures which make work possible and necessary for all those who need it. The police enforce both the possibility of work, but also, more interestingly here, the police enforce the necessity that those who could not live without it must work. It's a very strange formulation, right? Those who could not live for those who could not live without work, work is necessary. Right? Very interesting thought. But let's continue reading here. The question Voltaire would soon formulate, Colbert's contemporaries had already asked. Since you've established yourself as a people, have you not yet discovered the secret of forcing all the rich to make all the poor work? Are you still ignorant of the first principles of the police? So the police are there not to force the poor to work per se. This is the essence of the idea, I think. The police are there not to force the poor to work, but rather to force the rich to make the poor work. And this is this sort of essence of this idea of social control, right? Is that it's not simply that the rich control the poor. It's rather that this idea of this concept of what work is, of what, again, sort of, well, not again, but what virtue is, right? This new work ethic, right? So, we'll come to this, but what the police do, according to Foucault here in this classical period, is assign roles and assign sort of forms to the different parts of society. And this is, I think, really important, right? So you say the police, and he doesn't mean NYPD. He doesn't mean Bobby's in London or the Bombardier in Paris or whatever they're called. He's thinking about police and all of the rich connotations of that word, right? That word that stems from the Greek word polis, right? City-state, from which we get policy, politeness, and police, right? So that which sort of gives a society its form and definition is enforced by the police, is legislated through policy, is in society reinforced through politeness. What is policed are these social roles and what it means to have a certain kind of social role. So to be rich doesn't mean to be idle, certainly. To be rich doesn't mean to, oversee a farm. To be rich also doesn't mean to work yourself. What the rich do in the modern age is make the poor work. I think this is a very interesting idea. And so, as far as thinking about this in terms of social control goes, right, we'd say, well, of course, the rich are privileged, right? The rich are better off than the poor. In a society, you'd probably rather be rich than poor. But that doesn't mean that the privileged get to define themselves however they like. Well, not without some amount of consequence. Obviously, the consequences will be different, right? A rich person who, works in his own factory, or a rich person that doesn't make anyone work, right, has no job, doesn't engage in anything, is going to be shunned by society, is going to be punished, socially to some extent. Whereas a poor person who refuses to work is going to be thrown in jail in the classical period, or you know, end up homeless, right, in today's world. So that is a much harsher consequence. But nevertheless, there is a kind of consequence for not being rich in the right way. If you're rich, you can justify your richness by forcing the poor to work. Right? We still hear this, right? We still see this. The rich are good insofar as they are job creators, right? And the rich have an obligation to be job creators. So, in 21st century America, we still very much expect and want the rich to force the poor to work. So social control is this kind of defining of roles, and that was different prior to the modern age. The meaning of being rich, the meaning of being poor, the meaning of poverty was different. For example, right, we'll fit that into the larger story. So, this basic idea of the police, the idea that this is a shift in how society is controlled, what social control is, how it manifests itself. This Foucault tells over kind of intricate history, right? That begins at the end of the Middle Ages. Right? And he begins the story with a discussion of lepers. He says, at the end of the Middle Ages, leprosy disappeared from the Western world. In the margins of the community, at the gates of the cities, there stretched wastelands which sickness had ceased to haunt, but had left sterile and long uninhabitable. Right? From the 14th to the 17th century, they would wait, soliciting with strange incantations a new incarnation of disease. Another grimace of terror, renewed rites of purification and exclusion. Leprosy stops being a plague, right, at the end of the Middle Ages. And what is left in the wake of leprosy are all of these leper colonies, right? So leprosy was a contagious disease that led to, your body rapidly deteriorating, right? Your nose sort of rots off, your fingers rots off. It was a really horrible disease. And so the way that leprosy was dealt with was through confinement, right? That all lepers were sent to leper colonies. If you had leprosy, you would be expelled from your city, and you'd be sent to this leper colony, right? So what this leaves is this opening, right? Now Foucault is saying here, right, that these leper colonies, right, we can recall, madness gets a new homeland. Leprosy, prior to madness, had a homeland. Its homeland was outside of the city, expelled from the city gates. The city functions because it excludes leprosy. When the lepers disappeared, Foucault is suggesting there was a need for a new kind of exclusion. I think already implied here is the idea that lepers are excluded. Well, very much implied here. Lepers are excluded for similar reasons, or the exclusion of lepers from the city served a similar purpose to the exclusion of the mad in the classical and modern periods, in the modern period. So we could think, how would this be possible? How could this make any sense? I think that the important thing is to understand that leprosy, like madness, was a kind of excuse or a way to exclude a portion of the population. There were some lepers, there were some real lepers who really needed to be excluded, right, for public health. But because there was this excluded part of the world, a portion of humanity that was justifiably excluded from the state, that provided a kind of cover and a mechanism by which to exclude others who were inconvenient, who were a problem for the state. So when leprosy is cured, when leprosy no longer presents a health risk, society is left with this problem suddenly, that it has no viable means of excluding people, of pushing people out of it, right? Segregating a portion of itself. So, right, we see another moment of what I think is really going on in this story. Page 4 and 5, we get a couple mentions of this, right? So, when the leper houses are dissolved, Foucault notes, the excess revenues were now to be used for feeding the poor. That money that was housing lepers could now go to the poor. And what that sort of implies is that all of this money is in one way or another about confining and dealing with poverty. Again, he says, in England, these lazar houses, these leper colonies, were closed, and he assigned the institution's effects to the poor. So when the leper colonies go away, these become poor houses, right? And the poor are excluded. But this is not a good enough exclusion, right? To exclude people just because they're poor is insufficient, it's problematic, right? After all, these are Christian societies, right? Catholic, Protestant, whichever. The poor are precisely not to be excluded from society. And so when we think back to, Foucault mentioning that one of the major shifts in sensibility that takes place is a shift in sensibility toward the duties of assistance, we can see that, one of the things that drives this need for exclusion, one of the things that drives the need to have a kind of cover for exclusion is the fact that the poor should not be excluded. Right? There is a duty to assist the poor in a Christian society, theoretically. So in order to exclude the poor, there must be some other reason. Right? If we say the poor are mad, if we say that poverty is a kind of madness, we can then say, well, they are not excluded because they're poor, they're excluded because they're mad. So, the first moment that this shift in our sensibility toward madness begins is at the end of the Renaissance, or the beginning of the Renaissance, I'm sorry. And the beginning of the Renaissance, we see the emergence of the idea of madness. Excuse me. It's the beginning of the idea of madness in the Renaissance period. And this, Foucault says, right, we can see in particularly art, right, as well as in the writings of Desiderius Erasmus, who wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, where he writes, there are as many follies as there are men. Everyone is mad in some sense. And so in the Renaissance, right, we get the idea that madness is very common. So I suppose, let's say that two things happen in the beginning of the Renaissance. First, madness appears as a problem that needs to be excluded from the city. And there are actual exclusions, exiles of the mad. And these were literal ships of fools, right? That cities, especially in Germany, in Holland, would crowd their mad people onto a boat and literally send them out into sea. And so a ship of fools, a ship of the mad, would be sailing around. Foucault does a sort of nice analysis of sort of the metaphorical valence of this, right? There's a madness is like the ocean in a certain way, in the same sense that reason is like dry land, right? Reason is grounded, madness is shifting, groundless, and right, chaotic. So these ships of fools were the first form of exclusion for the mad, right? But madness itself is not a real threat, right? It's not conceived as a true threat. Madness is understood as folly. So just as Foucault will say, there's always been a distinction between the truly insane and those who are categorized as mad. And so, right, the sort of larger concept of madness was not understood as anything medical, and nor was it understood per se as anything sort of unusual, I suppose, right? There are as many forms of folly as there are men. Madness was understood as egotism. It was the madness of arrogance, the madness of pride, the madness of delusion in some sort of way, right? So that madness is found in all of us, but is worst in those who have a false self-image, right? Who believe themselves to be brilliant when they're actually stupid, who believe themselves to be courageous when they're actually cowardly. That sort of thing, right? It's the lack of self-understanding, the lack of knowledge of the world. It's a kind also of simplicity, right? Foolishness. But in any case, not a major threat. And so the most common forms, in addition to egoism, arrogance, pride, etc., were the madnesses of delight in the body, which was a kind of foolishness, a madness in the sense that one didn't know what the real world was, right? The world of forms, the divine world, the kingdom of heaven. That it was mad to seek bodily pleasure, to sort of live a hedonistic life. And so we see these two kinds of madness portrayed in the art of this time. And I think Foucault does a nice job discussing this. I'll post some of the Hieronymus Bosch paintings that he's talking about, but Hieronymus Bosch is an incredibly interesting, fascinating painter. And as Foucault notes, he has this painting called Ship of Fools, which is a painting that takes this topic of madness as its theme. Another, I think, important painting that Foucault spends less time on is Bosch's most famous work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which is a triptych, a three-part story, right, where on the at the beginning we have the Garden of Eden, and in the middle we have this bizarre tableau of humans just indulging in earthly pleasures, right? Garden of Earthly Delights. And they're all intermingled with animals, right? It's humans behaving like animals, and pursuing sexual desire, gluttony, being sinful, right? Having a good time. But it's a world of madness, certainly. And then we see on the third panel that this leads to the apocalypse and the damnation of all those people engaging in Garden of Earthly Delights. So there was certainly a moral element, as Foucault points out to this. Madness of this kind was a kind of lack of virtue, a lack of knowledge, and therefore was understood as evil, but evil only as absence and lack of goodness. So certainly evil would lead to hell, but it wasn't the same kind of threat, right? It was a kind of commonplace, everyday threat. The other one I want to mention is that this is the way madness is portrayed also in Shakespeare's King Lear, right? The madness of arrogance. Lear is arrogant about himself. He has a false self-image. He believes that his daughters love him and will take care of him, and that madness of arrogance eventually then leads to a more extreme kind of arrogance, extreme kind of madness, which will also ultimately lead to his death. So Foucault sort of tells the story of how madness progresses through the Renaissance as a kind of folly, the folly of arrogance, of pride, and is, eventually takes on this slightly more fatalistic sense, right? Those who have this kind of madness are doomed to death. We see that not just in Bosch, but in Lear. It's also the fate of Ophelia in Hamlet. Everything having to do with madness in Hamlet is fascinating. So in any case, right, madness is a topic of interest, it's a topic of concern, and it's only in this turn, the end of the Renaissance, this classical period, sort of between the Renaissance and modernity, how you sort of date and name these historical epochs is arbitrary, and Foucault is thinking about it as Renaissance, classical period, modernity. I tend to think of modernity as beginning with Descartes and stretching into essentially our moment. But in any case, right, for Foucault, beginning in the classical period, second half of the 16th to second half of the 17th century, we get this sort of shift in how we think about madness. At the end of the classical period, the beginning of the modern period, madness becomes goes through this transformation. Right? And what I want to highlight two things about this. First of all, that madness is dealt with through institutions. This is one of the major shifts. The mad are institutionalized. They aren't sort of put up with. They aren't allowed to roam. They are confined. Right? They're put into these homes. And that is an institutional process. Right? So, the reason why institutions are so important to Foucault is that institutions belong to, or the institutions that he's talking about, that interest him, belong to the my God. They are not, what's the word for, sorry. These institutions are institutions of what he calls the bourgeois order, right? The bourgeois state. They are not religious institutions, nor are they royal institutions. They are institutions of the monarchy. They are institutions of the church. They are institutions of the state, right? The secular state. And this is really why Foucault is interested in these institutions. Right? It's because these institutions are the basis of the shift from monarchy, that unity of monarchical power and church power, king and church are hand in hand. Right? That is a unified power. The institutions that will deal with madness are institutions that lie outside that unity of king and church. They are institutions of the bourgeois state. Now, this is really important because what Foucault is not talking about here is Republican revolutions. He mentions the revolutions, but these aren't the key, and he's not quite there yet. Right? But what interests him is the rise of a power that is capable of challenging king and church. Right? These institutions are going to be the beginning of a secular, liberal, economic, bourgeois order. The reason why he's calling this bourgeois is because, right, it is the bourgeois who are ultimately developing, consolidating the power that can challenge the aristocracy and the king. And the bourgeois are the sort of, you might think of them as the upper middle class, right? The merchant class, the owning class, not aristocrats, but right, the bourgeois comes from the German word Bürger, right? Those who were sort of powerful townspeople in the burgesses of Germany, and they were merchants, they were traders, they were those who were becoming rich and powerful through colonization, imperialism, through the new trade routes, the emergence of mercantile societies across Europe and the world. They were this rising class that had the ability ultimately to challenge the old aristocratic class. That could trace its roots back to, power that was gained through right of conquest, through wars in the Middle Ages. Right, so when Foucault is talking about bourgeois order, he's talking about this new power, this bourgeois power that's coming up in the 16th, 17th centuries. And this bourgeois order is going to ultimately be the order that funds and sort of provides the resources for democratic republican revolutions of the 18th century in the United States and France and elsewhere, and the 19th century. Right, these institutions that are helping to contain and confine madness are sort of the beginning of these bourgeois institutions that will eventually be institutions that are central to the bourgeois state, the secular bourgeois state that is installed and has power after the democratic revolutions. Right? I was thinking in particular about France. So, institutions, Hôpital Général in France and others, right, throughout England, France, and Germany in particular, he's thinking about. Now, the other important thing to recognize here, in addition to institutions, is that the reason for confinement, as he repeats over and over, is not medical. Right? These were not hospitals. Forgive me. It's not medical. The reason is social. Now, I think there is an element to Foucault that is drawing on an anthropological idea here. And that would be Emile Durkheim's idea of the distinction between the sacred and the profane. One of the founders of Polity, Emile Durkheim, posits that all societies are organized around ideas of sacred and the profane. We can see Freud using these ideas also, right? Totem and taboo. That which is an ideal, which is sacred, which cannot be transgressed against, and that which is profane, what is taboo, what must be excluded from society. And Foucault is sort of playing with these ideas. Right? So the sacred would be reason itself, that which is at the heart of society. And what is profane would be madness, that which must be excluded. So in a sense, Foucault is maybe saying, or there's certainly an echo of this idea here, that society, in order to function, has to exclude something. And in a society organized around reason, what will necessarily be excluded is unreason or madness. But again, I think there's something more concrete that Foucault is looking at here. And that is, again, this idea of poverty, of material economic influences and drives. That the reason to exclude and confine is not just to find this profane, to establish something as profane, something as taboo, right? We think this, again, return to Freud and say, society has to establish some law that forces all people to accept some degree of equality. In order to have society, we have to exclude something. There has to be some prohibition. So perhaps if Foucault is saying, what is prohibited is being mad. And that is simply a condition for having society. I think he's saying something a little bit more than that also. He's saying that madness became a way of excluding not just something arbitrary, but something specific, something that this new society couldn't tolerate. And at the beginning of this, it's not madness per se, right? Again, madness is a kind of means of excluding something else. Madness becomes redefined in order to exclude that which needs to be excluded, right? So what needs to be excluded? The poor. But why? Why the poor? Why are the poor a problem? Foucault mentions in several places, right? One of the reasons to exclude the poor was that they were just too visible, too sort of in your face, too much of a problem, right? This is very much the way we still, as a society, talk about homelessness, right? Homelessness is a problem because it's an eyesore, right? We need to put all the homeless people in shelters, not because we're maybe worried about the well-being of the homeless, but because I don't want them in my parks. I don't like seeing them. And the same thing is happening in the 17th century, in the early and mid 1600s, right? As well as in the 16th century, right? This is certainly a problem during the 16th century. The poor are outside, right, yelling for alms, yelling for charity. And this is a disruption to society. They need to be confined. Therefore, madness, what are these poor people doing? They are not working. Or in any case, I mean, so the reason why the poor are poor is unclear. In the same sense that there is no master narrative to explain civilization. Right? We would need some kind of master narrative to explain wealth inequality and poverty. There are lots of those. But what that means is that the poor are poor, or rather, we can understand poverty in many different ways. There is no one explanation. The explanation that serves the wealthy, the explanation that serves, above all, this bourgeois order, is the poor are poor because they don't work enough because they're idle. Now, this is a useful narrative for the rich because the implication is that one becomes rich by working. Even if you inherited all of your money, even if you inherited an estate and a title, you can say the poor are poor because they don't work enough. In saying that, one never acknowledges that one never had to work to get one's estate and title. No work went into that inheritance, right? That was passed down according to a hereditary line. It was inherited, right? If you're an aristocrat. And the same is true of, perhaps to a slightly lesser degree, of the most wealthy merchants, right? If you think about Renaissance Italy, right? Renaissance Florence, richest city in Europe, right? For the time period. You look at something like the House of Medici, not aristocrats in the typical sense. They're merchants, they're traders, but they're extremely wealthy. If you were born a Medici, you were wealthy for life. You had access to popes and kings. You didn't work for your wealth, but you could say the way to get rich is to work. If you're poor, it's because you're not working. Now, to say that poverty is a consequence of working, then, is to say that anyone who isn't working is to blame for their own poverty, and in general, right, is morally bad. And this is the essence of Foucault's idea. Right? Moreover, because work is the solution to poverty, those who are poor and idle must be mad because they aren't doing the only thing that would get them out of poverty. So that work is not only a moral imperative, you must work to be good, but it's also a kind of rational imperative. If you don't work, you must want to be poor, you must want to be bad, and the only people who would want to be poor and bad are the mad. So that madness could be identified with idleness, and idleness with madness. And so everyone who was not just truly insane, but also merely idle, could be confined, could be excluded from society. And that exclusion is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it helps get rid of a number of the poor. Right? Foucault says it was worth paying to feed these people and house them in order for them not to be part of society. Right? It is worth the money it takes to hide the poor, to prevent, it's worth the money to hide the poor. and that's very much still sort of our thinking. But moreover, right, in addition to hiding the poor, you're punished for being idle. Idleness becomes an unacceptable way of life. Now, the reason why that is significant is that it then becomes imperative to believe that you, if you're poor, must work. Right? We remember the principle of police is to make the rich force the poor to work. So one of the ways this happens is by saying idleness is a form of madness. You must work or you'll be excluded. And well, so what I'm trying to get at is what is happening here is the creation of an ideology, the creation of what Foucault called a new work ethic, a new ethic, new ethics, a new ideology. This ideology says you have to work. Work isn't necessary, it's an imperative. Anyone who would say, why am I working when the rich aren't working? Their only job is to make me work, right? The rich own the factories in which I work. The rich provide me with the possibility of working, but the rich themselves don't work the way that I work as someone in poverty. I might say, this system is unfair. I'm not going to work. Why should I work when they don't have to work? They say they worked for their money, but they didn't. They inherited it. They got that factory from their grandfather. I reject work. I reject the ideology that tells me I must work. I'm going to be idle. Right? Idleness is a rejection of the whole ideology that makes the whole system work. So idleness must be excluded, not just to hide the poor, but in order to defend the system that makes all of the parts work. Right? I was listening to a podcast about country music and its origins, right? And talking about the way that country music has sort of become immune to the way that country music essentially has is this intensely patriotic genre of music. And let me just say, I actually love country music of all kinds. But it's interesting to remember, right, that, okay, so country music is kind of the music of poor people, right? It's country music is the music of hillbillies, right? Just go, scroll through the top 100 country hits of the last 10 years, right? It's all about a sort of hillbilly life, a working class aesthetic. But it is also intensely patriotic and is, anti any criticism of the government, right? So it's about how to be poor and love the government anyway, right? Uh, but if you go back to the earliest country music, you get these songs that come out of the Depression, the Great Depression of 1929, and even earlier than that, that come out of the labor unions that were part of breaking up the monopolies of the late 19th century. You get songs like the one that came to mind, "Hallelujah, I'm a Bum," right, which celebrates idleness, right? So that's Harry McClintock, "Hallelujah, I'm a Bum," and celebrating idleness and saying, "I don't have to work. I don't want to work. To hell with all the people that tell me I have to work." That is kind of rebellious. It's dangerous. It's dangerous to question the imperative to work and the moral goodness of working. All right. So we'll leave it at that for today, and we'll pick up again next week.